KZSU-FM Stanford. Welcome to another edition of Hearsay Culture on the Hearsay Culture Network. My name is Dave Levine. I'm an associate dean at Elon University School of Law, as well as an affiliate scholar at the Center for Internet and Society at Stanford Law School. I'm excited to have back on a repeat guest, someone who was on the show, I've got to say, 10 years ago or so, to discuss issues involving infrastructure, and particularly digital infrastructure. The guest is Brett Frischmann, who's the Charles Widger Endowed University Professor in Law, Business, and Economics at Villanova Law School. Brett is also someone that I've known for a very long time, not only through our joint affiliation at the Center for Internet and Society at Stanford, but in lots of overlapping conferences and work in our mutual areas of interest. It's been a long time since I had Brett on, and it's really a shame because we're finally doing a conversation that we could have had at any point over the last multiple years, but certainly should have today. Last week we had on the show Robin Bergeon. Robin was talking about his projects involving open source platforming around Bluesky and how to improve the social media networking environment in which we all operate, whether we like it or not. And unplanned and unscripted, it became a Brett Frischmann fan club for a couple of minutes where I brought up Brett's name, then Robin brought up Brett's name, then I mentioned Brett again. Then before we knew it, we started saying, yeah, Brett's great and we love his work. And it got a little awkward. It made it seem like, maybe Brett was paying us for this or there was some other unusual relationship, which there isn't. But it got me thinking, as I've been thinking to myself, we should have Brett back on the show. Let's have Brett on. So Brett is here today and we're recording on January 30th, 2025. So I'm very happy to have Brett here. We're going to be talking about infrastructure at the biggest level. And infrastructure is a word where people hear the word and they tune out. They leave. What is this? It's inside baseball. And let's be very clear. It's boring. No one wants to think about the fact that a road, yes, and Brett's shaking his head. No, we're going to make it more interesting. But the visceral reaction is it's boring. Who cares about how the road is built? Who cares about what materials are used? I want to get from A to B. I don't want to think about, right, to use the old cliche, how the sausage is made. Well, it turns out that when you're thinking about infrastructure, your interactions with it operate at any number of levels. Yes, you're driving on that road, but you also have an interest in making sure that the road works. You also want to make sure that the road isn't stopping you from doing the things you want to be doing, that the road's encouraging you, right, to make a left turn when you want to make a left turn and not make a left turn into another car. And the same issues arise with regard to technology. Over the last, and it's amazing to say, right? I'd say the last 20 years, Brett has built his reputation focusing on digital infrastructure and what it means and how we should think about it and how we can optimize it for society. His work has also been involved in an area of particular importance in the early days of the internet and still a giant issue, the question of the commons, how we maintain the internet as a great resource for all. And then his work has moved more recently, and we're going to talk about it, into areas involving design and how we design technologies and think about how we should design. And this is not just design theory and design space kind of stuff that has become popular in recent years, but it's also a concept we're going to talk about in a recent article that he's published dealing with friction in design, how design can create nudges and roadblocks and other aspects that allow people or nudge them to move in certain directions or stop them from going in further in a different way. We're going to close the discussion today with the discussion involving an amicus brief, a friend of the court brief that Brett has filed in a case that's now pending in the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. The name of the case is Shaluti, I believe I'm pronouncing correctly, v. Uber. Uber is a prime villain, of course, in a variety of technology spaces, and so it's not too surprising that Uber might get sued here. This is a case, though, and Brett's brief is about online contracting and the issues associated with online contracting, particularly questions of notice. What should consumers understand, which is a huge issue as we now roll out, whether we like it or not, generative AI. So we have a lot to cover in a short period of time. Brett is joining us via Zoom. Brett, thanks for coming back on Hearsay Culture. It's great to see you.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's been way too long since we've had a chance to chat,
Yeah.
and thanks for the invitation.
Of course. So I want to start on a very serious note as we think about infrastructure. Again, we're recording on January 30th, and last night, this horrific accident over right near DCA, right near Reagan National, involving a collision, as we understand it right now, between an American CRJ passenger jet and an Army helicopter. And we're not going to talk about aviation or any of those issues, but I want to frame this issue for listeners in a very tragic but a very serious way, right? We don't, it's early days, so we don't know why the accident occurred, but based upon early reportings, obviously, this is a terrible accident that involved a very busy airport and apparent training missions and training flights that the Army flies over the Potomac. As anyone who's flown in and out of Reagan National knows, it's a very busy airport, and pilots know that it's a difficult place to fly in and out of because of all the air restrictions. And suddenly now, as is often the case, people are talking about infrastructure, and they're talking about it from the perspective of, does the Federal Aviation FAA have a administrator, which at least as of this recording, an acting one has been appointed. But people ask questions and they say, wait a minute, I make assumptions about flight, I make assumptions about what's safe, I make assumptions about what's going to happen and not happen, and then a tragedy ensues, right? With at this point, all no survivors, right? Everyone on both aircraft tragically died. And we're talking about infrastructure. And so, framing it that way, Brett, I want to kind of get us into the discussion by saying, why is it when we think, do you think when we think about infrastructure and when infrastructure comes up, it always seems to come up in conversations after something has happened that people don't like, or it comes up in ways that are esoteric and people can't figure out?
What a question.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And you know, my thoughts go out to the families and the victims, and I generally shy away from talking about events as they're happening when I
Right.
know very little about the actual details, despite the
Sure.
fact that in our current culture, the temptation is for everyone to jump and have a million different thoughts about something they know very little about. And
Yeah.
I will just admit I don't know enough to comment at all
Right.
about uh, the tragedy last
Right.
night.
And I want to be clear
But
for listeners that we don't, and I'm not asking you to
no, I
speculate
know.
on any of it, but I'm really talking about the
I
media
got you.
culture around it. Yeah.
I got the question.
Yeah.
I'm just
Yeah.
clarifying that just
Yes.
in general,
Yeah.
whether it's this or something else, there is this temptation to immediately jump and speculate on all sides, including among experts. And
Mhm.
like my default position is always to wait and learn and try to learn more about what's happening.
Mhm.
Now, to your actual question, which is not necessarily
Mhm.
about that, is why is it that uh, we take these things for granted until it's too late.
Mhm.
Until a bridge collapses, until a major accident happens, until infrastructure doesn't function or deliver what we take for granted that it's going to give to us. And that there's a couple of reasons. I mean, one of the reasons is that it's incredibly complex. That the scale of the infrastructures we rely on make it hard for people to sort of actually understand where they came from. Uh, Another reason is that we've just been we've the use and availability has been normalized in such a way that we just take things for. I mean, to be honest, what drew me into infrastructure way back in the early days as a grad student um, was largely like trying to think about all of the things that we take for granted that generate incredible amounts of value in our lives.
Mhm.
And if the listeners just if you take 3 minutes or talk about this with your kids, or if you're driving the car, pause our radio and like have a conversation, like try to make a list of the things that you take for granted. But that if just think about like whether it's energy and power, whether it's healthcare systems, whether it's the existence of legal regimes that you rely on to sort of facilitate, keep you safe, keep you secure, enable transactions, whether it's mobility in the world, like your ability for you to move around, but also goods and services to be transported at a distance to you, communications capability, like lots of basic capabilities that allow us to flourish in ways wouldn't have been able to imagine decades ago, much less centuries ago.
Mhm.
Um, they kind of define modern civilization. Like modern civilization depends heavily upon all sorts of infrastructures of many different kinds that we completely take for granted and most people barely understand,
Right.
and we only pay attention to them when they break. So
Mhm.
that's like one. I mean, and so that I got drawn into that. I tried to sort of think carefully about it. And the interesting thing is, in many different fields of not only in law, where I sort of reside, I guess, but also in economics, in engineering, in science and technology studies, and a variety of different fields. Um, it's infrastructure also is there's not a special field of infrastructure studies. Like it
Mhm.
doesn't exist necessarily as its own category.
Mhm.
Um, and so 25 years ago, I would say for 25 years ago, you mentioned the word infrastructure, and people reacted the way that that you just described. Their
Mhm.
eyes glaze over. That I used to give talks at conferences, and people would start snoring and falling asleep because I said the word infrastructure, and it was kind of a running joke. Oh, here
Yeah,
comes
yeah.
Frischmann.
Yeah.
Time to doze off, right? You remember this because
Yeah,
I
I
know
know, I
you
do.
do.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Not nowadays.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think that it is shifted. I think in the last 20 years, infrastructure has at least become something that uh, people recognize as something worth studying, worth paying attention to,
Mhm.
albeit oftentimes not until too late. As you said,
Mhm.
something happens and then we pay attention to it.
Mhm.
Um, I think the other thing about the tragic scenario is it highlights two other things that maybe we
Yeah.
don't need to talk about them, but I'll just throw
Yeah.
them out there because
Yeah,
they
yeah.
come to mind.
Mhm.
One is in infrastructure investment and infrastructure policy, there's often an emphasis on building new stuff, the
Mhm.
latest, the greatest, the most innovative, the thing that I'm going to get credit for as a politician because I put this new thing in my state
Right.
or my location or whatever. Um, and there's less emphasis on maintenance and repair, like keeping the things that already exist up to date, well functioning, and so there's a lack of attention to the maintenance and care sort of function of already existing infrastructure. So that's one tendency that we have. The
Yeah.
other thing is we ignore the governance.
Mhm.
Like an important part of studying infrastructure is not just the underlying resources and what they give to us or enable us to do or afford, I should say, afford us as users of those infrastructures. But there's also, they all rely, every infrastructure, whatever kind of infrastructure we're talking about, always relies on different forms of governance.
Mhm.
They can be
Mhm.
public, they could be private, they can be hybrid, they can be community based. And much of my last 20 years of research, whether in knowledge commons or in other fields, has been about studying the governance of different infrastructures, like
Mhm.
different kinds of governance approaches. And so when you look at the role of air traffic control, right? And I'm not an aviation expert, but if you just think
Right.
about it for a second, the reason they're sort of executing an incredibly important governance function over the use of a shared resource,
Mhm.
right? The basic idea is airspace is congested, it's shareable. We can all share it in different ways and use airspace in different ways simultaneously. And yet it's subject to a kind of what economists would call, or engineers would call it, a congestion problem. It's easily congested if it's not managed. Well,
Mhm.
managing congestion, like managing, use of the shared resource requires governance. It requires rules. It requires expert operators, increasingly sophisticated systems that are built on top of the airspace itself in order to make it function well as an infrastructure.
Mhm.
And then, when things go wrong, they go wrong. And I won't sort of comment on why or in this instance, because I just don't know.
Right. No, and it's the environment in which we think about infrastructure that's the real challenge here because, just to extend kind of the big picture a bit more, right? Obviously we've had flight for decades and decades, and accidents happen, and in despite what was is obviously a tragedy, and regardless of why it happened, right? People then get back on airplanes, right? I mean, people got back on airplanes this morning at once the airport opened again, at Reagan. And of course, you know the nature of flight and travel being what it is, most people are kind of you know they either don't think about it or they're amazed that any of it works, right? And undoubtedly though, people make, and this is my point, right? They make a calculated decision and they look at it and they say, well, what are the odds, right? And I have to be here and what have you. I booked the flight this morning on American. So people make these decisions over and over again, and of course our hearts go out to all of the victims. But the fact that we're talking about it means, and yet the infrastructure continues to operate, right? We continue
Right.
to until it doesn't, and when the infrastructure breaks. Right. You know, again, you know, the flights continue, right? The internet operates, but when the infrastructure stops, right? When the airport closes, when the internet doesn't work and doesn't move packets, then suddenly people say, whoa. And the other follow-up point to that is functionally, what do we do then? Right? Your reaction and both of our reactions to this tragedy is it's too early to tell and we're not experts. But as you pointed out in the beginning, lots of others say, I have the solution and I know what to do. And then policymakers often go in that direction. And we've seen a lot of that history of whether we call it, you know, not well thought through, rash, you know, knee jerk regulation of infrastructure over the last 20 years. Haven't we, Brett?
Yeah. I mean, I think that that's the problem with our political system.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
I mean the reaction we're reactionary. I don't think it's just concerns infrastructure per se. I mean,
Hmm.
the thing about the air flight stuff, it's not surprising that people are still flying. I mean,
Hmm.
even with the accident that occurred yesterday, and even with other accidents that we know do occur, some of which are avoidable, perhaps, and I don't know if you don't know about what
Right.
happened yesterday
Right.
or
Right.
what, and some of which are unavoidable. But nonetheless, air in terms of pure safety for like distance traveled, flying is actually is quite safe
Hmm.
compared to, for example, to sort of
Yeah.
driving an automobile. And accidents on roads happen, and sometimes because of failures of the infrastructure to sort of moderate traffic, and some more often perhaps because of failures of human error or drivers. But
Mhm.
again, nonetheless, we still use the infrastructure because of the benefits it provides to our daily lives.
Mhm.
Far exceed the risk that people perceive from the possibility of a predictable but unlikely accident.
Right. Right.
Um, so yeah, I think that's right. I think the one of the things about regulation of infrastructural resources in response to um, sort of failures is that, yeah, as you said, it can be a quick political reaction to
Mhm.
earn quick points and not necessarily dealing with the long term. I mean, and I don't want to go here. You just
No,
made me
no,
think of
no, and
you
I,
made me
and
think. No, you made me think of
yeah,
the rebuilding in
yeah,
L.A. I mean, I was just
yeah.
thinking about
Hmm.
like which is an infrastructure problem as well.
Hmm.
And do you rebuild the infrastructure and the societal fabric in destroyed communities to be resistant to the next predictable disaster?
Hmm.
Um, or do you quickly rebuild as quickly as possible to get people back into the lives that were unfairly disrupted and destroyed often?
Hmm.
And so there's trade-offs in terms of how even rebuilding the infrastructure in a situation like that. And
Right.
I'm not going to take a position that we ought to do one versus the other, although I lean the longer term view of rebuilding efforts in a situation like that is to build in anticipation of those kinds of risks.
Right.
And we know how to do it. The engineers in that field, I mean, I'm not expert in that field, but
Yeah.
experts in that field know how to build that infrastructure in a way that would reduce the risks in the future. But the question is whether we have the political will and to do so, and
Right.
that's always a tough thing to figure out.
We're chatting with Villanova law professor Brett Frischmann on Hearsay Culture and the Hearsay Culture Network. So yeah, so big picture here, Brett. You just mentioned one last point before we dive into friction by design, right? And how we can start thinking about these regulations. Of course, generative AI is now all the rage, and everyone wants to talk about it, and there are a variety of regulations around it, and I don't want to get into all of that here. What I want to talk about there is what happens when a new technology appears and we have to immediately start thinking about it in the ways that you have suggested in terms of regulating an infrastructure, right? Artificial intelligence is without question an infrastructure of the internet, right? And it's one that's being used in ways that we know about and ways that we don't know. When you think about regulating infrastructure and the kinds of considerations that we should be thinking about as we craft regulation without regard to what the regulation might be, based upon this work that you've done looking at regulation of infrastructure and thinking about infrastructure, what would you tell policymakers they should start doing in thinking about that? And again, we know that the EU has already had some regulations in space, but most places don't, and certainly the United States doesn't, right? There are random laws around the country that might be dealing with these things. But if you're talking to policymakers about getting into that infrastructure regulation space, how should they frame the issues?
I mean, it's a good question. Although I think uh, I don't know that I would approach regulating AI or regulating Gen AI as a
Mhm.
subset of or type of AI um, as fundamentally or purely a question of regulating infrastructure. Because I don't think
Okay.
all AI is infrastructure. I think
Mhm.
actually drawing infrastructural AI, AI that actually is a shareable input into a wide variety of different use cases
Mhm.
is a different it doesn't describe all AI. Like so
Mhm.
some AI are incredibly narrow focused, have very narrow range of uses. All
Mhm.
all AI is shareable in the sense that it's an informational good that's sort of a public good in terms of its basic characteristics, but
Mhm.
not all of them are generic multi-use
Mhm.
general purpose technologies
Mhm.
essentially.
Yep. Fair enough.
But so I think one step in thinking about regulating AI is to actually differentiate among different AIs in terms their of their design, their functionality, and what they're used for.
Mhm.
Um, and I think actually, again, I'm not an expert. I mean, I've read and
Mhm.
talked a bit about, but I'm not an expert on the EU's AI Act. But there are distinctions drawn in the act based on narrow purpose versus general purpose, like
Mhm.
whether
Right.
something's general purpose and has wide variety of
Mhm.
applications, what those applications might be. So I think that actually does reflect some a difference recognized between infrastructural types of AI systems and those that
Mhm.
aren't. I guess
Mhm.
one thing I mean, so as I think about and writing a little bit about sort of the kinds of governance. I mean, when I think about governing AI or governance systems for AI, sometimes they involve government regulation.
Mhm.
Sometimes they involve community governance, and sometimes they're just governance in terms of um, you might think of them as decision protocols for procurement, for example, which isn't
Yeah.
necessarily rooted in law,
Mhm.
although it could be, and perhaps in some cases should be.
Mhm.
Um, so I think one thing about regulating AI um, is to think about that one question, sort of like adoption
Mhm.
and procurement and decisions about when to use it and who makes those decisions. So one of the things about Gen AI going hog wild on society, like, is just the open release. Oh, so OpenAI sort of releases
Right.
ChatGPT in a fashion that basically puts every institution and organization and societal context, whether you're talking about schools or homes at whatever level, in
Mhm.
workplaces, all of a sudden have to sort of grapple with this new, accessible, available kind of AI system.
Mhm.
Um, and that, you can't put the horse back in the barn after it's already been released. And so it's that
Mhm.
question of sort of like, should we be thinking a bit more at the societal level about the release of technology and how quickly things are released?
Mhm.
That's one. Another is sort of as those institutions around the country, including my like Villanova dealt with this, like kids' schools dealt with
Mhm.
this, is like,
Yeah.
how do we think? Like, what are our policies? How do we think about our own governance of the use of these technologies? And is it a matter of just like, guidance rules and policies that are non-binding on any actors, or is it about formulating like when should a school actually purchase licenses and purchase access? When should they be deployed actively in the software that staff and employees are using? Heck, I mean, I'm in an active debate. Like one of the things I'm engaged in lately is age gating, or sort of
Mhm. Yeah.
if age, then governance rules. And if
Right.
age can be if minors, or it could
Mhm.
be if elderly, it could be
Mhm.
if, but whatever the
Mhm.
criteria, if there's a vulnerable group or there's a group for whom there's autonomy concerns, you might have if age, then there's a set of governance rules that apply. We do this all the time offline in a variety of contexts. The
Right.
debate that we're in, not just for AI and stuff, but for a lot of things, is should we be doing this online? Um, and one of the one of the things that comes up if in age gating kind of
Mhm.
technology is the concern about age verification. And
Yeah.
so I
Right.
couldn't be at this event that's occurring right now in
Yeah.
DC because I'm doing this with
Yeah.
you because you rescheduled. But what I was going
Thank
to
you.
say at what I was going to say at that event, one of the things I
Yeah.
planned to say
Yeah.
was one of the easiest age gating that we should, one of the easiest implementations of age gating that we ought to be doing doesn't require age verification at all.
Mhm.
It's simply age gating where we know all of the people are in fact minors.
Yeah.
In other
Right. Right.
schools, like we
Mhm.
should, like ed tech is a
Yeah.
joke, first of all. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
lots of ed
Yeah.
tech is a joke. Like
Yeah.
the demonstrable educational benefits proven to exist from various ed tech software and ed tech implementations is lacking in
Yeah.
incredible amounts of example. I mean, we don't as educators or as purchasers of technology demand evidence of effectiveness and deliverables, and it's a lot of it's speculative and hype.
Right.
In We
Right.
might be able to personalize learning in such a way that might improve it, but in fact it's not clear that we ever demand those things at the procurement stage or
But
the adoption
and
stage.
that's, I mean, that's kind of the issue, right? I mean, and that's a great example of it. You go back to, I've been saying for and writing, right? And the way I put it is, Sam Altman, right? Unilaterally decided that the world was ready for generative AI. Right. And similarly, a few years earlier, right, because of COVID, we suddenly, and I'm sure you had the same experience that I did. I went from, one day teaching in person and giving a closed book exam to literally the next day, everyone's maybe online. Your exams change and everything else. Why? Because circumstances changed, right? But the point is that I lack control, right? I lack decision making authority. I lacked agency in all of it. And it seems like that's exactly where we are with generative AI. In other words, and this is, I mean, I was going to get to this somewhat cynical question later, but now I'm going to ask it, right? From a perspective of infrastructure regulation, unless you are in the room, right? To paraphrase Hamilton, right? Unless you're in the room, what agency do you even have to have input in these processes? And as you pointed out, we're using generative AI whether we like it or not. Zoom, right, benefited enormously, right, from the fact that COVID happened. And it doesn't make Zoom a bad entity. And I'm not suggesting Zoom wanted COVID, but the point is that it seems like we never. And maybe that's the question too. Is there an example of where we get ahead of this stuff and say, before we do this, as you just said, let's think, let's plan, let's use what Urs Gasser and Victor Mayer Schomburger wrote last year, guardrails, and come
Right.
up with them. So what's your reaction to that? Am I being too cynical? Am I being too
No,
cool? Yeah, yeah,
no, I got a lot of things to say about.
yeah, yeah.
I
Go
think we
ahead.
need
Yeah,
like another couple. We need another
yeah.
couple hours on
Well,
this.
yeah. I'll give
Um,
you a few minutes on this. Yeah, and
yeah.
then we'll turn to
So,
friction by
well,
design.
not even on this, but I'm just saying
Hmm.
like there's so much packed
Yeah,
in that.
yeah.
So first of all, nothing is inevitable. We often feel we have no agency, but we do. We're often led to believe we have no agency because we're caught in sort of rat races or a fear of missing out, or that's in
Mhm.
part engineered through media and through hype and through manipulation by those vendors, whether it's ed tech vendors, making schools feel like if they don't implement the teachers and the schools going to fall behind,
Yeah.
or it's hypesters about the AI revolution saying if you're not deploying Gen AI in every law firm or in every business or in every teaching opportunity, your students are going to miss out, your clients are going to miss out, you're going to be missing out. And so everyone feels like they're always behind and racing to catch up. And so they've just got to go along with the, you know, the next best thing that's being offered and pushed down our throats.
Mhm.
But in fact, you're not a Luddite if you're, because I'm not a Luddite. I'm a pretty tech oriented person,
Mhm.
but you're not a Luddite for saying, I want to slow stuff. I was about to swear. Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah.
Slow
FCC
stuff,
doesn't like that. Yes.
slow
Yeah.
stuff down.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Madeline Sanfilippo, who's one of my favorite
Yeah.
co-authors and a bunch of stuff,
Mhm.
Madeline and I have an article we published an Internet Policy Review a few years ago, I want to say,
Mhm.
or maybe it was
Mhm.
a year ago, on slow governance.
Mhm.
And it's about smart cities, and it sort of gives a bunch of
Mhm.
prescriptions about here are a bunch of questions any city ought to ask and be able to answer before they deploy supposedly smart technology. And by the way, supposedly smart technology is a much better term than AI.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so as far as I'm
Yeah.
concerned, AI is
Yeah.
kind of this joke, kind of
Yeah.
meme-ish, kind of all category
Yeah.
that captures way too much. What we should be
Mhm.
talking about are supposedly smart technologies,
Mhm.
technologies that are supposedly smart, but you should ask like how smart, by whom, who gets
Yeah.
what intelligence, and how, what data, what is it, blah blah blah. A whole bunch of
Right.
questions you can ask. But the point is, before a city deploys any kind of supposedly smart technology, they ought to ask. There's a whole series of questions. It's kind of like an impact assessment in the human
Mhm.
rights or the AI space, but it's a little bit different. It's a little bit more focused on governance and functionality and what's proven use cases and things like that.
Right.
But the same stuff we say about smart cities applies to schools and organizations, your home, a lot of areas where we are like rapidly adopting smart technology because of feeling of keeping up with the Joneses or not falling behind. You ought
Mhm.
to just stop and slow down and think about and genuinely evaluate alternatives and what the actual utility of the technology is going to be for you. And
Mhm.
most people just don't. It's where we are often moving too fast to be able to slow down to do that. And one of the reasons we move too fast in our digital networked world is for the last 25 years. This is go back to some of your infrastructure stuff.
Yeah.
For the last 25 years, the optimization criteria for almost every digital network technology is to minimize friction,
Yeah.
make everything seamless,
Mhm.
and maximize efficiency, growth, scale, etc.
Right.
And each one of those design principles are fundamentally flawed. They
Mhm.
fundamentally like take us down a path we don't want to go.
Well,
It's
let me
not that
inter I'm
there's
gonna, I'm
some
gonna, and I want to interrupt you right there just simply to say you're listening to KZSU-FM Stanford and infrastructure. I think I can say that at Stanford University. Radio's an infrastructure, right? I mean, so
Yep.
of Stanford University, it requires donations from listeners to continue its diverse programming. Please email us at donate@kzsu.stanford.edu and check out hearsayculture.com for the Hearsay Culture Network's various programs, including my show with Denise Howell, R&D with D&D, and Denise's show, Uneven Distribution. Okay, I interrupted you, Brett, and I want to go right back to it. All right, so go ahead because
Right.
you're about to say, go on. Yep.
Right.
Yeah.
So the connection to guardrail, the book by
Yeah.
Urs
Yeah.
and Victor is a
Yeah.
great book.
Yeah.
Um, Guardrails are an example of what Paul Ohm and I, in an article in the Harvard Journal of Law and Technology, called governance seams.
Hmm.
Right.
Hmm.
So there's seams between systems. Right. Your home, the architecture of your home, the walls are a seam. Basically, seams are borders, boundaries, or interfaces that are designed where friction at the seam enables governance.
Hmm.
The problem over the
Now,
last
now get
25
that just, but let me interrupt you quickly, just for listeners who aren't familiar. So, what do you mean by friction? What's an example of friction that people should be thinking about?
Well, so friction, there's a lot of different kinds of
Yeah,
friction. And this,
right.
this is actually kind of the point. So
Yeah.
frictions of a lot of different types are
Hmm.
things that slow down, or they cause a sort of you can think about speed bumps,
Hmm.
right? A speed bump slows you down, but it's
Hmm.
not just to slow you down for the sake of slowing you down. It also moderates your driving, makes you aware that you're in the kind of neighborhood where there are potential kids running across the street, or there's other uses of the street for which moderating your driving behavior, your speed would make sense, right? So the the friction could be something that slows you down. Friction could be informational. Friction could be um, asking you a question. So authentication procedures like passwords, or authenticate like CAPTCHA. I'm a human, not a bot.
Mhm.
Or like there's a whole variety of different frictions that entail sometimes transaction costs, but with a purpose. They often
Mhm.
have an instrumental function or a purpose, which is to enable, and in the context of governance schemes, like you can think of APIs as
Mhm.
governance schemes between technical systems, and you can think of some governance schemes are like user interfaces.
Yeah.
So user interface design can be frictionless or frictionful. And so, I don't know if we did this last time I was on, but like
Yeah.
any of your, don't do this if you're driving, but if you're
Yeah.
listening to the show and you open up your iPhone and you go to your settings and you turn off geolocation privacy,
Right.
turn it off, and then you turn it back on, and then you look at what's the difference between turning it on and turning it off. They take different steps. Turning it
Mhm.
on is frictionless, one
Mhm.
touch, and you get a green signal which tells you safe, good, keep going, drive ahead, whatever.
Yeah.
If you turn it off, you go to hit it, takes multiple steps, multiple taps. You get a bunch of text that you don't want to read because it's off gray little light, and you get a
Yeah.
red signal, red, danger, stop, don't do it, go back.
Yeah.
So that's frictionless in the direction of no privacy, no
Mhm.
geolocation privacy, and it's friction full, right? Lots of
Mhm.
friction stacked against privacy.
Mhm.
Okay. So
Mhm.
that's one kind of friction, which is like if we've got multiple steps and even the colors, red versus green, right? Those are different kinds of friction that lead to similar outcome. One is, pro privacy, and one is,
Yeah.
frictionless and against privacy, and friction full for privacy. Now, the same thing exists for other user interfaces. And this is, I don't know if I'm helping you save time, but if we
Yeah.
get to the contract stuff, like,
Yeah,
so
we will
if,
in a moment. Yeah.
all right, so I won't get
Yeah.
there yet. So
Yeah.
when we get to contracts, we can
Yeah.
think about how digital contracts are
Right.
fundamentally designed to be frictionless in the
Right.
direction of contracting, but friction full in terms of you actually understanding anything about what you're contracting over,
Yeah. Yeah.
just like the iPhone example. And
Mhm.
so the guardrails or governance seem idea, like the way I would think about regulating AI in general is to sort of, okay, call it supposedly smart tech first. Second, identify systems and subsystems and interfaces and look at if you're looking at social media, it's not one big thing. It's not one single system or one single algorithm. There's multiple algorithmic systems performing different functions on the intake, on the processing, on sort of prioritizing and directing content, on advertising. There's a bunch of little subsystems that are connected. You can have uh, governance seams. You can have seams between those systems instead of having them interconnect seamlessly. You
Mhm.
can put friction in there that enables governance. Governance by whom? Maybe by the social media company and employees, but also maybe by outsiders
Right.
or by
Right.
users,
Right.
right? Same thing at the user interface, right? So if you think about the user interface with social media systems, say, for example, at their feed, right? You could think about, well, what ought the governance scene look like? Or what ought the guardrail, if you want to call it a guardrail, what ought the guardrail look like? Well, the point is, what are you trying to enable? If you want to afford users an opportunity to make decisions about what they're doing online, well, then you might, as I've argued in some paper, some work, you might ban something like infinite scrolling,
Mhm.
right? So like
Mhm.
infinite scrolling is unambiguously, despite NetChoice's lies in a recent brief in the California court. Um,
Yeah.
Infinite scrolling
Yeah.
is not an editorial choice about
Right.
speech or anything. It's garbage.
Yeah.
Infinite scrolling is fundamentally just about eliminating a governance seam.
Mhm.
It's about eliminating that little bit of time and opportunity and reason a user might have in between videos or whatever's loading
Yeah.
to stop and think about, should I continue? Is there something else I should be doing with my time?
Right.
Right?
Right.
Finite scrolling versus infinite scrolling is about a design feature, not about editorial decisions or content. It has nothing to do with the content. Infinite
Mhm.
scrolling works the same way, regardless of what the content is.
Mhm.
So,
Mhm.
like, regulating it is content neutral. It has to do with the manner in which content is presented to users. If
Mhm.
you put a little bit of friction in between the loading of different things, it gives people an opportunity to self-govern.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
self-governance is an important thing when it comes to using social, I would argue, when it comes
Yeah.
to social media. But
So,
they're designed for maximizing engagement, time spent on the thing, which is literally like what swiping and tapping behavior generates revenue, either through
right.
advertising or through collecting data that can train AI systems. But like there's specific, you know what I mean? Those are narrow uses of a social media infrastructure, But if you put that social media infrastructure and you tried to have a general set of other uses, if you designed it for other uses by users that generate public and social goods, like if you optimize social media to enable genuine social interaction, or you optimize social media for meaningful strong tie interactions as opposed to interactions with strangers, it would be designed very differently. But as I said in 2012 in the infrastructure book, a privately owned infrastructure like Facebook or Twitter or whatever is going to very quickly be optimized for a narrow range of uses. And they all are. All of them are designed for a narrow range, collecting data and time spent clicking and tapping and like meaningless superficial interactions, like clicking a heart button.
Well, so the friction by design work, and for listeners that want to read more, Brett co-authored a book with Susan Benish, who is also extremely well known among listeners, who's at Harvard, and the article is titled "Friction in Design Regulation as 21st Century Time, Place, and Manner Restriction." And what the article, I'm summing up the article very simply to say that there's a lot of concerns about how you do these things, and the First Amendment often stands in the way. And as Brett just alluded to, right, there are ways to deal with it. I don't want to focus on the First Amendment here as much as to get to the broader issue, which is this idea of efficiency, as you alluded to, right, has been driving regulation throughout, right, time, right. I mean, why do we have statutes of limitations, right? They're an easy way for courts to decide very quickly whether a case should happen or not. Why do we allow, right, as we will talk about in a few minutes, right, why do we allow consumers to more or less agree to agreements by just clicking a button, right, as opposed to having to negotiate and go through terms? Well, because efficiency plays a role, and we wouldn't have transactions. And so you make the case, as you already have, and you certainly point out in the article as well, that we've put efficiency and speed, right, over other aspects of this. But to push back on that a moment, what do we do with the reality that many consumers don't care, that people aren't reading agreements? People aren't really interested. I'm going to say it again. I know it caused you some agita at the beginning, right? But people don't really care about how it happens and why it happens. They just want the quick fix. They want the dopamine hit, which obviously has been studied in social media. What do you do with that fundamentally? And this is, of course, a societal problem, because we see apathy and lack of interest playing a role in everything from the election on down. And we don't have to talk about politics. But so what do you do with the consumer? It's just like, I don't care, Brett. I don't care, Dave. Whatever it is, you turn it on, you turn it off. I'm making my choice, and my choice is I want this to happen fast because I want my TikTok or I want my whatever it is with the device. How do you respond to that?
That's a great question. It's a response for the last 20 years. Like it's I've heard,
Yes,
you
yeah,
get this
yeah. I know
often,
it's not a new one. Yeah, yeah,
you get this this
yeah,
kind of
yeah,
question a
yeah.
lot. Like,
Mhm,
hey, just like leave it to the market, let consumers.
mhm.
What you say, it's kind of funny
Yeah,
how you put it. Like,
yeah, yeah,
let me make my choices and leave me alone. Like, who are
yeah.
you, Mr. Elite Paternalist, to tell me? Dude, I'm not an elite paternalist telling anybody what to do.
Mhm,
Um, that I don't care whether you get your kicks watching TikTok videos or playing your gotcha game on your app, or what you choose to do with your time. Like I'm not going to tell people what to do to make themselves happy, but I do
mhm,
want people to recognize, and I think as policymakers and academics studying this stuff, we have to pay attention to the fact that the presumption in marketing, econ, public policy discourse, law as well, over the last, I don't know, 40 years at least, that people's preferences and their beliefs about what it is they want are stable, durable givens, and
mhm,
that like what we're doing when we're choosing to spend our time is a is not a manufactured choice, or
mhm,
that choice is not heavily so. You may think when you click I agree and every single time you interact with a contracting interface that you are making choices, but you're not.
mhm.
That's not most of the time that choice is, well, you're making a choice in a
Yeah,
technical term and
right.
technical sense, but the range of options in when you're making that choice are incredibly narrow and limited, and they're engineered to make it seem to give you the illusion by clicking a button that says I agree, or clicking a button that says I have read these terms and conditions, when everyone knows it's a lie.
Mhm.
You've not
Mhm.
read any of those terms and conditions.
Mhm.
In order to get to the other side and be convenient, we understand there is the notion of a kind of choice being made, but the kind of choice are being made is heavily engineered.
Mhm.
Take privacy, for example. People love to say, the
But
question of
hold on, Brandon. I just want to push you on this, right?
yeah,
Are you saying that if we, or we, I shouldn't say we, if companies that are putting contract terms in front of consumers, right? So let's use the Apple example and the iPhone. Are you suggesting that there is a way to present that information to consumers such that they would actually read it and understand and take it seriously? Because I can see a lot of people saying the bottom, and this is contract law, right? And I don't want to freak people out by bringing contract law into it, right? But contract law has a duty to read, right? And most of the time, if you don't read something, you're held to it, and contract law more or less operates that way, absent things like fraud and so forth. But I don't know. It's hard to convince people, I think, that there's any way to design, right, an assent process, and this gets to your Chaluti brief, right, that would actually get people to do anything different than what they did. If you put one word that said "I agree," they're going to click on that. If you, I mean, short of saying you're giving, you're signing over your left arm, right, to Apple, and we're going to amputate it next week. I don't know that there's a lot that people would do except say, just tell me where to click.
okay. So, couple things.
Yeah.
Uh, uh,
And I am pushing back on this, as you can tell.
That's great. No, that's
Yeah,
great.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
great. This
yeah.
is the point of the digital. So I have a paper with Moshe Vardi, who's a computer
Uh-huh.
scientist at
Yeah.
Rice,
Hmm.
called "Better Digital Contracts Through Pro-Social Friction and Design." That
Hmm.
gets in real detail if your readers are interested
Yeah.
in this question.
Yeah.
And then there's a Chaluti brief.
Yeah.
Um, so we could talk about the
Which
contract
we're
stuff,
about to get to. We're about to get to
which we're gonna
Choliti.
we're gonna get there, and I'll
Yeah.
answer that
Yeah.
question you just asked as we kind of go through Chaluti.
Yeah.
It's probably the best way
Okay.
to do that.
Yeah.
The bottom line is uh, my answer to you is, in the short term, in the immediate sense, the current who we are, who most of us are today, um, are going to like balk at the idea of any friction, no matter what
Mhm.
it is.
Right. Hmm.
Don't give me an alert saying, hey, like there's warning alerts before you post that social media site that it's going to go to 1,000 strangers. I don't care. I'm going to post what I'm going to post. Don't bother me about any information. Hey, if I'm in Europe, and because a cookie consent directive, it like changes in the GDPR and then the cookie governance for privacy. Hey, it used to be accept all, reject all, and it was a really easy choice. I just accept all so I can move on.
Yeah.
Right. And now they're complicated. And there's cookie consent mechanisms all over the place. And there's like accept all and reject all. And there's this intermediate option, like only functional cookies and advertising cookies. And
Hmm.
everyone complain about, oh my God, all the
Yeah.
fatigue, all
Yeah.
the stuff. And in the short run, that's right. It
Uh,
is fatiguing to have more consent mechanisms pop up. Guess
yeah.
what? When there was just two options, accept all, reject all, everyone thought those were the two options. They
Yeah.
had no preferences for the intermediate options they didn't know exist.
Hmm.
You can't possibly have a preference for something you don't, and especially in a new technical system, you can't have a preference for something you don't know exists.
Yeah.
You can
Yeah.
only have now. If I have the whole presumption in contracting and in privacy about all this stuff is that people are making choices in markets and they know what they're doing. Let them make choices. But choices preserves options. I can't make choices in privacy if I think there's two options when there really are seven, but you're
Hmm.
not telling me about the five in between.
Hmm.
Once
Okay.
I once I start learning through pedagogical friction in design, once I start learning about other options, I can start to have beliefs and preferences about them. And then I can start either to act on those in making choices in markets, demanding different things, but I also can act on them in political and vote for different things.
Hmm.
Both political systems and market systems depend on people having preferences about things, but the preferences themselves are contingent on options and knowing about things. And if you don't know about what the options are, you can't have a preference about it.
So would
And
you?
so part of the
Yeah.
argument I'm making is that dynamically over time, in the short run, I agree. No one's going to like any kind of friction. They're going to plain wine and they're going to hate it.
Yeah.
But in the medium term, but by the way, we're only in this spot
Hmm.
because the last 25 years we've lived in a digital networked world in which there's been a constant persistent effort to design frictionless systems that engineer our preferences
Yeah.
to think that the only option is to click to move on to the next thing as
Hmm.
quickly as possible,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
So look, that's one thing. So one is like our preferences about stuff is shaped by the environment we're in and what we get exposed to.
Mhm.
And so we have to, and that's infrastructural, by the way.
Yeah.
The environments we find ourselves are infrastructural. They
Mhm.
shape our preferences and our belief. And if they don't afford us the possibility to experiment with our preferences and to form our own preferences, and instead we're literally just following scripts set by designers, well, then sure, the illusion of making choices exists, and we get used to that.
Yeah.
To change the pattern, it's going to be disruptive. And yes, people are going to balk at the idea of some friction. But again, I think, is it possible? Yes. Second thing on the
But
contracts
what
point,
I
yeah,
want to get to the contract point here, and we have about like 7 minutes left. But I just want to be clear about this. So just out of curiosity, so if we had the design system that you propose that actually informed people, and then people made a terrible decision, are you okay with that?
yes.
Okay, so that's really
But
so,
but but
okay.
as long as we know they're actually informed. Now,
Uh,
so this goes to the contract stuff a little bit.
yeah,
Like
right,
so
which is now where I want
like
to get to. Yeah.
we know notice doesn't, like, overwhelming people with notice doesn't
Mhm.
work.
Yeah.
Again, people don't pay attention. It's hard to digest. There's too many notices. You have decision fatigue. So like notice alone is not enough.
Mhm.
And in the US, for privacy and contracting, we rely on sort of a notice and like sort of illusion of choice regime, where people, like, you give them notice, you give them a choice in theory, and they just click and they move on.
Yeah.
And there's been a million people who criticize why that doesn't actually work very
Mhm.
well,
Mhm.
right? The proposal I'm would one of the I should say one of the proposals we're making in the contracts context,
Yeah.
is to say, and this is what's in the Chaluti brief. I
Yeah.
basically, so to just summarize real quick,
Yeah. Please. Yeah.
The Chalutis, I think it's in 2019. Shannon Chaluti is in a wheelchair. She needs a wheelchair accessible Uber. She orders an Uber ride. I think her and her husband get in the car. They get in an accident Uber, and then of course, they get a lawyer and they're suing, and they
Mhm.
want to go to court. They go to court, and Uber moves to compel arbitration. The trial court says, "Yep, you got to go. You got to go arbitrate this. You clicked when you ordered Uber Eats, you ordered an Uber ride. When you downloaded the app and on your phone, you basically click through the agreement. And when you
Mhm.
did that, there was an arbitration clause in the agreement, so you have to arbitrate. Goes up to the intermediate appellate court. And by the way, there's similar cases to this in New Jersey and some other
Yeah. Right.
places.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
sort of percolating a little bit.
Mhm.
Um, and so then in the intermediate appellate court says, well, wait a minute, like, you didn't really, there's not enough notice about the arbitration clause. And basically what arbitration clause means is you're waiving your right to trial. So the idea
Yeah.
that people can't go to trial to vindicate their rights in front of a jury of their peers, and instead got to go arbitrate with people in some other place. No, we don't think that there was and they criticized the effectiveness of the notice and so that's gone up to the
Mhm.
Supreme Court.
Mhm. The
I filed
Pennsylvania Supreme Court, just to be clear. Yeah.
Pennsylvania Supreme Court.
Yeah.
I
Mhm.
filed a brief, and I don't file amicus briefs. I don't see myself as an activist. I try to sort of stay out of activism sometimes. I mean, sometimes I get pulled into it, but I sort of don't do it very often. And I certainly have not written my own amicus brief. But
Mhm.
I saw this case, and I was like, okay, gotta file. Like, one, it's a chance to sort of try to move the law, move the needle a bit.
Mhm.
Two, it's a chance to sort of make the argument, make the case in a very applied and specific context.
Right.
And the argument is rather straightforward. It's that reaching agreement is fundamentally what contracts are about. Always have been. Contract and agreement almost are like synonyms, right? The whole
Mhm.
point is contracts are about a mutual agreement between two parties. The thing about agreement is it's a meeting of the minds. But the thing about a meeting of the minds is it's very hard to know what's in someone else's mind.
Mhm.
And so
Mhm.
contract law has worked with the objective theory of contracts on this idea that, well, it's hard to know what's in someone's mind. So we'll look at what they manifest in the world, like what they do. Like signing a contract is an action that's going to
Yeah.
manifest but still the fundamental basis of contracts is agreement, right?
Mhm.
So what I end up suggesting is that the court should abandon, in the digital contracting context, it should abandon or just not recognize notice and assent, notice and an action that manifests assent, clicking a button and like I agree,
Mhm.
as a sufficient means for establishing agreement.
Okay. Uh-huh.
And
Yeah.
instead, the court should adopt a new standard, which is what I call demonstrably informed consent. And what that would
What
do
does
is
that mean?
what that means is
Yeah.
it puts the burden it would put the burden on the contract drafter or designer of the interface to
Mhm.
generate reliable evidence that the person understood what they were the substantive terms that they're agreeing to.
And how would they do that?
So the way they do that is with friction in design. So
Okay.
think
Mhm.
of you've got to teach people about the substantively important terms. In this case, it would be an arbitration clause, what it means to arbitrate as opposed to go to trial court.
Mhm.
And then you've got to authenticate that or confirm that they comprehend what they just agreed to. So
Mhm.
how do you do that? Well, you do something like you ask questions. If you've ever done an ethics training online, which I've done some for IRB training and stuff. Have you ever done that? They know how to do this. We've
Mhm.
done this in other online courses, online ethics trainings. You ask people questions, they
So,
answer
so
the
you, so
questions.
you, so you quiz them and say, "Did you just sign away your right to go to court? Yes or no?"
Right. Or you
Yeah,
frame it in a way. Yeah,
yeah,
there's different ways. Like you
right.
can
But I mean, that's the
insert maybe
idea.
to make it
Yeah, yeah,
reliable, you might do it a little differently than that. But yes, the point
yeah.
is you ask just like captchas
Hmm.
are an authentication procedure with a little friction that you do a little work to
Hmm.
prove that you're a human, not a bot.
Hmm.
And in doing a little bit of work to prove you're a human, not a bot, we provide security for all, right?
Hmm.
You provide security for you in the service provider, but also more generally. Just like passwords require you to go through a step, two-factor authentication is a speed bump to authenticate that you're authorized to access certain services. Friction in design and contracting is similarly a bit of friction to show, to generate it, to perform a task that shows you understand what you're agreeing to. If contracts are supposed to be agreements that people are binding themselves to substantively important things, like I don't get to go to trial in the case of an accident, they ought
Hmm.
to understand what they're agreeing to.
Are there examples where that's actually being done?
No, who
Yeah.
would do
Okay.
this? The
All
law,
right, I just want to be
the
clear.
law.
I just want to be absolutely clear.
Well,
So,
no,
so
no, no,
it,
no, no. It's
yeah.
done in ethics training. Like we
No, no.
try to
I
mention
mean, in
in
contracting the way you're
contracts.
describing. Yeah,
No,
yeah.
because
Okay.
I mean, look, if I run an IRB, if I do a human subjects experiment at my school and I put people through IRB, I have to get informed consent. But
Yeah,
we do paperwork and there's a whole bunch of stuff that has to be in the informed consent process. It's not just clicking a button. You can't just click a button to get through our informed consent. But
yeah.
no, the reason no digital contract looks this way is because the law has bought into the Chicago school way of thinking about contracts from Easterbrook's opinions in the
Yeah.
80s that
Uh,
basically say it would be inefficient. The efficient way to manage create contracts online is to have this note like something like this notice and assent. It sort of supports the idea of this notice and assent
yeah.
style contracting.
Do
So
you?
we
Go ahead. I'm
across the
sorry.
board,
Yeah. Mhm.
all 50 states pretty much recognize, at least at lower court level, not all Supreme Courts, by the way, have
Mhm.
recognized, which is why in the Pennsylvania Supreme Court has not affirmatively adopted notice and assent as being sufficient, which is why I filed this brief. And I'm
Yeah.
looking for other Supreme Court cases where I could similarly try to nudge the law in this direction.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Do
pretty
you?
much the law of the land is notice and assent is enough.
So I'm not going to ask you, I was a litigator, you practice. I mean, I'm not going to ask you, so what's the outcome going to be? We don't know. But I will ask you this question. Do you see
Oh,
this?
I'll tell you. I'll tell
Well,
you. In
well,
all,
I was
what
going to, okay, fair enough. Go ahead. All right, if you want to.
I mean, what the outcome should be is the
Yeah.
Pennsylvania Supreme Court should adopt my rule,
Well,
and
right, right, right,
the
right.
world would
Yeah.
slowly get better.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
what I've been told by all the my colleagues who've read the brief and who've like engaged and applauded me for trying, putting in the good effort, the response has uniformly been, um, maybe you'll get a mention in a concurrence.
Right, right.
You know,
Which, by the way, I mean, I mean, not for nothing is how law reform happens. It doesn't happen overnight. And if, you have one judge say, even in a dissent, say, an interesting way to approach it. So let me close here because we only have about 30 seconds left, Brett. So I'm going to ask you a really easy question in 30 seconds. When you look at the broader infrastructural regulatory space in which we operate, where is there room for optimism that we can see the kinds of good decision making that you have called for in any space? We now know what the Pennsylvania Supreme Court might do in Triluti, but where can we look for optimism, or at least a way to say, okay, here's a place where we might see some good stuff happening? You have 20 seconds.
oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Uh, I mean, if we're thinking about the digital online world, I think there's lots of interesting folks sort of trying to build infrastructural systems with and on a community driven basis, not
Yeah.
necessarily purely decentralized, put everything on the blockchain kind of thing that we heard 5 years ago. And, there's still a lot of that happening.
Yeah.
But I just mean like the open source community builds social infrastructures.
Yeah.
I was just talking a couple days ago with the World Wide Web, some folks at the World Wide Web Consortium, and
Mhm.
about like their conceptualization of the internet as a commons and sort of the infrastructure commons that exist at different layers and how to.
Yeah.
So there are lots of people like thinking hard and trying to move in the right direction. And it's just it's a you're fighting against the current going very strongly in the opposite direction, at least in the digital context.
Brett Frischmann of Villanova Law, thank you for joining us today. Back on Hearsay Culture after a period of time. Great discussion, and I hope you enjoyed being here.
That was fun. Pleasure. Thanks for having me. We'll talk again next week, 2 weeks. I don't know.
Yeah,
Sometime.
very, very, very soon. Very soon. You're listening to KZSU and the Hearsay Culture Network. Please stay tuned for more diverse programming and have a great day.
What do you think? I don't know. Is it weird?